watch. Treble 17. Double 18. Yes! Simply sensational. Darts Holy Grail. For darts, Holt's young property. A hunt from Barney.
There was a stretch of years when Michael van Gerwen didn't just play darts. He made other players feel like they'd already lost before they picked up their first dart. World champions walked out against him, already bracing for the result. The crowd expected it, the bookmakers expected it, and for the better part of a decade, they were right almost every single time. But somewhere in the last few years, something changed. Not his ranking, not really. Not even his results, not in the way you'd think. What changed was simpler than that, and somehow heavier. So here's the real question. How did the most feared player in modern darts stop being feared? Let's go back to where it started, because to understand what he lost, you have to understand what nobody else in darts ever really had. Michael van Gerwen picked up his first dart at 13 in a small Dutch town where the game was something you grew up around rather than something you discovered. By 17 he already looked like the future of the sport. He won the World Masters that year and then, almost as a flex nobody asked for, threw a televised 9-dart finish a few months later. People started talking about him the way you talk about a prodigy who's about to skip the line entirely. Except that's not what happened next. For the next several years, the breakthrough stalled. He reached the final of the PDC World Youth Championship and lost it. Then he reached it again the following year and lost that one too. Imagine being 17, being told you're the next great thing, and then spending your late teens losing the finals everyone expected you to win. That's not a montage moment. That's the part of the story that gets cut from highlight reels. The years where the prodigy just looks like a very good player who can't quite close it out. And then it clicked. By the early 2010s, he wasn't just winning, he was winning in a way that made the rest of the sport visibly nervous. In 2014, he won his first world title, beating Peter Wright in the final at 24 years old, the youngest champion the PDC had ever produced. He'd go on to win it twice more, in 2017 and in 2019. He'd sit at world number 1 for 7 straight years. But here's the thing the highlight reels never quite capture. It wasn't really about the trophies. It was about what happened in the heads of the people he was drawn against. Talk to anyone who played him during that stretch, and you hear the same thing in different words. They didn't walk out hoping to win. They walked out hoping to survive. Commentators stopped asking if Van Gerwen would win and started asking by how much. Crowds didn't gasp when he hit a 180. They expected it, the way you expect a freight train to be loud. That's not dominance in the ordinary sporting sense. That's something closer to psychological occupation. He didn't just beat opponents, he moved into their heads months before the match and never fully left. For years, that fear was worth more to him than any single throw. A player 2 legs down against Van Gerwen wasn't thinking about the next dart. He was thinking about whether there was any version of tonight where this ends differently. Mostly, there wasn't. So here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because eventually, there's a night where the fear doesn't show up to do its job. It's the 2025 World Championship final. Van Gerwen, 3-time champion, walks out at Alexandra Palace and the crowd boos him. Not because they hate him, because the 17-year-old waiting across the stage is the story everyone came for, and Van Gerwen is, for one night, cast as the man standing between the audience and the fairy tale. He goes 4-0 down before he's even settled into the match. The kid across from him, Luke Littler, ends up tearing through the final 7-3. Taking the record for youngest world champion straight off Van Gerwen's own name in the history books. And what Van Gerwen said afterward tells you everything about how that night actually felt from the inside. He didn't make excuses. He looked at the kid who just dethroned him and said something almost gentle for a man who just lost the biggest stage in his sport. Every so often, he said, a star gets born, and that's one of them. That's not the sound of a man in collapse. That's the sound of a man watching the gap close in real time and being honest enough to say so out loud. Because here's what actually happened in the years around that final, and it's easy to miss if you're only watching the scoreboard. Van Gerwen didn't fall off a cliff. The floor around him rose to meet him. Luke Littler arrived as a teenager and within a year was breaking records that had stood for Van Gerwen's entire career. Luke Humphries climbed to world number 1 with a level of consistency the tour hadn't really seen before. None of that is really a story about either of those two men, not for our purposes here. It's a story about what it does to the most feared player in the sport when the players underneath him stop being afraid and start being good enough to prove it. For a decade, the gap between Van Gerwen and everyone else did a lot of the work for him. Opponents lost matches they hadn't fully believed they could win. Once that gap closed, every single one of those matches had to be won the hard way, on the night, with nothing but the dart in his hand. And that's the part that's harder to watch than any loss on a scoreboard. The aura doesn't show up in the stats, there's no column for it, but everyone in the building can feel the difference between an opponent who's already beaten and an opponent who genuinely believes he can win tonight. By 2026, almost nobody walking out against Van Gerwen carried that old resignation anymore. He missed the quarterfinals in the first 2 premier events of the season, something that hadn't happened to him since 2012. He suffered his earliest World Championship exit in a decade, beaten 4-1 by Gary Anderson. He failed to qualify for the Players' Championship finals for the first time in his career. His own close friend and fellow pro Vincent van der Voort said it plainly, that Van Gerwen had eased off the gas without quite noticing, and that the bill for those quiet years was finally coming due. None of that is the same as collapse. He's still ranked inside the world's top 4. He's still capable, on the right night, of average numbers most professionals will never see on a scoreboard in their entire careers. What's gone isn't the talent. What's gone is the head start. The fear used to do half the work before he'd thrown a single dart. Now he has to do all of it himself, every single match, against players who've spent years studying exactly how to beat him. There's a quieter layer to this too, one that rarely makes it into the highlight package. Earlier this year, with crucial ranking events on the calendar, Van Gerwen skipped them to take his 2 children to Ibiza instead. The darts world reacted the way it usually reacts to a champion stepping back, with warnings about ranking points and prize money left on the table. But there's another way to read that same decision. A man who spent over a decade living out of hotel rooms, defending a throne every single week, chose a beach with his kids over another tournament hall. That doesn't undo the ranking slide. It does complicate the idea that this is simply a man falling apart. Sometimes the thing that looks like a man losing his edge is actually a man quietly deciding which parts of his life still deserve the version of him that gives everything. So maybe the real question isn't whether Michael van Gerwen is finished, because the evidence simply doesn't support that. He's still winning matches most professionals would build a career around. In May this year, he won a Players' Championship title for the first time since 2024. Beating Dirk van Duijvenbode in the final after a semi-final performance that looked, for 90 minutes, exactly like the player who once owned this sport. And back in September, on home soil in Amsterdam, he did something that mattered more than the trophy itself. He beat Luke Littler, the man who'd taken his crown and his record, in the final of the World Series of Darts finals, and afterward he said something simple and true. "I've never been away." Maybe Michael van Gerwen never becomes the most feared player in darts again. It's entirely possible nobody ever does, not the way he was for those 7 years at the top. But if he can still win, still reach finals, still beat the very players who replaced him, without that fear doing any of the work for him anymore, that might end up being the hardest version of winning he's ever had to do. Not the most feared man in the room, just a man still in the room, still throwing, on nothing but what's left in his hand. So here's the question worth leaving you with. Do you think Michael van Gerwen finds his way back to the very top of this sport, or have we already watched the best version of him come and go? Let us know what you think. And if you want more stories that go past the scoreboard, stick around.